Hi, I'm Anthony. I'm a NUH medical resident and also an active AI researcher. So I have two questions for Prof. Simon with regard to healthcare AI regulation. So the first question is with respect to the challenges that you have raised, which I thought are very well presented. Specifically on the first, on basically the speed as well as on the challenges of interpretability when it comes to opacity and things like that. So I think there's predominantly two groups of people out there in this space. They are arguing. One are the group of people that are like the doomsayers. Essentially, they are saying that AI will take over the world. There will be severe ramifications. And there's the other group of people who says that regulation needs to be more targeted. So the first group of people essentially belongs to people like Elon Musk and a few other individuals. And the second group of people are people like Andrew Ng and Ian LeCun. So I was just wondering whether which groups of opinion have you so far analyzed and heard and thought about, and who should we lean more? Where should we lean more towards in thinking about regulation when it comes to whether we should be more worried about something that is more on the doomsayer end or on the more practical aspects of regulation? So I think that's the first question. The second question with regard to, I was just interested in the framework in which we should approach regulation in this particular sphere. So when it comes to healthcare regulation, there's the Healthcare Services Act, which regulates licensees and services, and there's also a Medical Registration Act, which regulates medical professionals, and there's also the drugs, which is regulated by agencies such as the HSA. So I was wondering whether such a framework can be adopted for healthcare AI regulation, and that we need to certify people who know how to use these AI models. We need to certify the AI models itself, and we also need to regulate the services when they use the AI and in terms of governance, etc. So can this be implemented? Can this be ported over? And also, I'd like to just get your opinion on when should we put this up? When should we put this up, write this act, or even put this through Parliament? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try and be brief, but I mean, a really interesting set of questions. On the first one, general versus specific, I mean, I've been saying for some time, I think regulating AI begs the definitional question, what is AI? And it's a suite of technologies. Ultimately, it means statistics and regression analyses and complex calculations, which I don't think it makes sense to regulate at that level. At the other extreme, yeah, you can just regulate use cases, and a big part of my work is really saying that most laws can govern most AI use cases most of the time, that you don't need all these new rules. But probably in some sectors you will need specific regulation, and I think healthcare is one of them. And there, one of the challenges is that at the moment the healthcare space, and my colleagues know much more than I about this, but in terms of the law, medical devices are regulated, pharmaceuticals are regulated, but AI that's not invasive, AI that's not kind of a robotic treatment is for the most part in many jurisdictions not regulated. So a doctor using a diagnostic algorithm is treated the same as a doctor using Googling for information or looking up in a textbook. It's all on him or her. And as this technology becomes more sophisticated, that's going to be a problem. Could we learn from these other models? I mean, I thought it was fascinating when Insoo was talking about the regulatory processes associated with stem cells. I was thinking no one at OpenAI was having to deal with any of this when they were developing large language models. Which brings us back to your first question. There is now a discussion about whether we should be regulating computing power, so regulate compute. But at the moment, that's really limited to essentially the geostrategic challenge where America is kind of trying to regulate compute, not within America, but by trying to stop China having access to high-performance computing, including the kind of GPUs that are made in Taiwan, which is a kind of dangerous place to make this stuff, and moving some of the technology to the United States. But I mean, a question that could be much more done in depth, but that's a quick stab at an attempt at a response.
Thank you. Yes,
thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. I'm Tae Suk-Mui, practicing anesthesiologist and intensivist. I greatly enjoyed the talk, particularly Prof. Simon, because like my colleague at previous, with his answer, we have various acts for different aspects of healthcare, and that's quite clarified. So with regards to AI, it's very exciting because in terms of population health and being able to extract data and being able to preempt or manage this in terms of AI methodology. So we are actually encouraged to leverage on AI technology and capabilities to be able to deliver value care and if personalized to our population and in fact personalized to, prompt patient-reported outcome measures. So there's great power in that. So in this setting, would it be, because you are in the legal profession, would you be able to share what are the thoughts with regards to AI regulation for the medical aspects, if you can, right? Is there a framework already? Because we understand there's a move, that there is, the difference between guidelines to regulation. So what are the legal thoughts in terms of that? Because it would be helpful to have more medical legal kind of discussion and understanding and not end up like Jesse or, not that we will, but just to hear your thoughts on this.
Again, briefly, and I'd actually be interested in Insoo and Julian on this because in this context, we've got new technology. What you think about AI in terms of regulation and guidelines, and Julian, I will push back on, I don't think there's complete consensus. I'm quite comfortable with different answers in different jurisdictions and political approaches which encourages experimentation. So maybe that's a provocation. But in answer to your question, I mean, the problem, and I defer to all the medical experts to some extent in the room, there's a huge difference between law and practice, law in the books and law in action. And that's long been the case in the medical field, because in theory, we have patient autonomy, doctor-patient relationship. AI is posing challenges there. If the doctor doesn't understand the AI system, it's very hard for her or him to give good advice. If the patient doesn't understand, hard for him or her to make a decision. But that's quite common in medicine. And in the context of euthanasia, for example, at the moment, the law is pretty clear. Murder is murder, but you have this sort of ethical get-arounds of double effect doctrine, act omission doctrine. You also have cases anecdotally of doctors who will essentially, conspire is the wrong word, but families will not reveal full information to the patient who in theory should be autonomous in making the decisions. So I think there is real scope for having rich debates about this, but these are not new debates in medicine. And I suppose in addition to the general question, I do want to provoke Julian a little bit on how individual consent is valued in that framework you outlined, which appeared to be a very utilitarian approach. How do we get the maximum benefit for the maximum number of people? When some people would argue, and again, back to that question of religion, not to present it myself, but to say, some people would say, look, the patient autonomy and the choice of that guy who decided to take a risky treatment should be valued over the neonate or the infant who is incapable of expressing a preference. So how individual decisions factor into that decision-making process.
Well, maybe I'll say something about your issue in medicine in 1 second, just to answer this question. So you're completely correct. Ethical reasoning won't get you to some single ground truth. It will expose the range of values and the decision in a clearer light. But then ultimately there's a question of, do you value consent more than safety? So in the pandemic, do you value freedom more than public health or well-being? And there are going to be different ways of answering that. So your challenge is, well, isn't it legitimate to value consent and autonomous authorisation higher than reducing expected harm? Yeah, it's reasonable. I guess I was trying to argue the opposite case, that we should prioritise, in this case, minimising expected harm over consent. Now, I think what I'd like to see Singapore do is make their own decisions about how they prioritise these values and not just import a kind of dogma. So the dogma is consent must always, supersede considerations of harm. I think you can reasonably flip those around And that's what China is doing as well. China is flipping around the order of values that we've commonly accepted. And I think it's up to us to rationally interrogate them and decide, okay, this is our order and here are our reasons for it. So yes, you could adopt that. Just with respect to the issue of AI in medicine, a lot of people think it's going to be a fundamental challenge to the doctor-patient relationship, and the key problem is explainability. The key problem is the same problem that we've had throughout this series of talks. It's about reasons and justification. So it's justifiability, not explainability. So what's key to the use of AI in medicine is being able to justify the course of action that you're taking, whether it's independent or in conjunction with AI. So when an ophthalmologist uses AI to diagnose my retinal disease, and he says, we need to do laser therapy because the AI says so, I want to know what his reasons are for that proposition. I want to know how reliable it is, why he trusts the AI in this circumstance. So, what's still key is that doctors are able to exercise their ability to reason and convey those to patients using AI. So it won't be enough to just say the AI told me so. You'll have to know its reliability, why you should trust it, just in the same way as you should understand, as a good doctor, the limits of and the use of clinical trial evidence. You don't just say, well, I'm prescribing, well, maybe we'll use clinical guidelines where the colleges will say, use AI in this circumstance, just like they say, use statins in this circumstance. But that really turns the doctor into an instrument. Ultimately, I want from my doctor his ability to tell me his reasons, whether or not that's using AI or not.
Thank you very much. That's very clarifying and enabling affirmative, actually. And I also want to allow me to just chip in about patient autonomy. You're absolutely right. There's patient autonomy. But a lot of times in practice, it's very unequal because there's unequal power of knowledge, and we see the context. So that's exactly what you said, and about, coming from the perspective of reason and outcome or application justification. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on time, and we've just gone past 7 o'clock. Please join me. Oh, was there another question? Would you like to? Yeah, all right. Come on, Madhvi. He's one of our PhD students. Madhvi, please go ahead.
Yes, hi, Madhvi from the Center for Biomedical Ethics. So my question to the panel is kind of just to gauge your views, particularly Prof. Chesterman, on the possibility of AI being conferred personhood. It's kind of on the same vein as, say, the legal tradition in countries like India, where non-human entities like rivers or trees are given personhood in order to receive the sort of constitutional protections such as right to life.
Okay, I can be brief. I think it's a terrible idea. But there's actually, David Gunkel has this really interesting graph of people who think it's possible to give AI personality or not, people who think it's a good idea or not. I'm in the definitely possible but shouldn't. And you're right, India, temples can also be given legal personality. The entire ecosystem of Ecuador has been given legal personality. It's a dirty secret of legal philosophy that legal personality is fundamental to any legal system. Who has rights and responsibilities? And there's no really good explanation for it, except that there are two categories. There's natural persons, where humans, and the definition of human is a real challenge in this space. And I will ask Insoo maybe if he wants to comment on the sort of limits of humanity and how that's been affected by debates in the United States. We have some people saying, no, human goes back to conception. So human, we're all given rights, and artificial persons meaning corporations. So we could create artificial legal personality, but why would you? And basically there are two reasons. You want to sometimes reward people when something goes right, or you want to punish someone when things go wrong. And so back to the case of the autonomous vehicle, if the autonomous vehicle crashes into me, shouldn't we be able to sue the robot? No, you should sue the corporation that made the robot, and a limited liability for the autonomous vehicle would just protect the corporation. Or maybe you want to reward someone when something goes right, and that's the example of AI engaging in patents. There is a kind of half additional reason, and this goes to the kind of more speculative future, that if we think there's a possibility that AI will eventually surpass us, then maybe it'd be a good idea to give AI rights now in the hope that it will give us some rights then. But at the moment, that's in the realm of science fiction. But I am interested, I don't know if Insoo wants to say anything about the definition of humanity in the US.
Yeah, it comes up in my area as well, whether they're talking about human-animal chimeras, especially neurological chimerism of a species closer to human, like non-human primate, or even embryo models. You know, do these deserve protection under the law in places where embryos are protected, or at least restricted in what you could do with them? And I think there's a great confusion here about assuming the humanity, as you're calling it, or status, is a biological property, reducible to a biological property, so that when you transfer cells into the animal, or when cells are doing something kind of interesting at the early stages, so that's necessary and sufficient for humanity to be present. I tend to think that humanity and moral status is an emergent property of not just natural persons or cells, but just, you can imagine aliens being persons as well, right, or having a humanity. So I think there's a great confusion, at least in my area, of assuming that when you're transferring cells or cells are doing something, that all you need to look at are biological properties to then answer the humanity question. And I think it's much more complicated than that.
So this is a question of moral status. I've edited a book on this. And as Insoo says, the question also comes up with brain organoids or human, non-human chimeras. And the question is, you know, are they a person? Are they a sentient being? So typically personhood is a special category of sentient being. It's a conscious being that can project its own self into the future. So it's a subset of conscious being. So one question we have to ask is, can organoids be conscious? Can machines be conscious? And my answer is yes, in theory, but the reality is we struggle to define consciousness in human beings, and we have only limited ways of detecting it. So it's very difficult to say whether an organoid or a machine is conscious. Now, the so-called Turing test is really just the ability to mimic consciousness or the response of a conscious being. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to go on between now and the next few years in deciding what constitutes consciousness for operationalisable reasons in organoid research or in AI, and then how would we detect that? And the answer is we just don't know really at the moment. So it's possible that in the next few years, one of these machines will be conscious, but it will be very difficult for us to tell that. The Turing test is a hopeless test of it.
One last comment. Peter Singer is coming to speak, and he gained some notoriety, among other things, for at one point arguing, I think I'm recalling this correctly, that certain primates, like chimpanzees, should have more rights than severely disabled humans because they have a better experience of consciousness. There were lawsuits through the 2010s in New York trying to argue for rights for chimpanzees, partly to protest against animal experimentation. These were unsuccessful, but the judges concluded that although they couldn't give legal personality, they weren't comfortable saying that these were mere things. And in the AI space, one interesting sort of move in the direction I think you were pointing to is, at the moment, if I set fire to my computer, maybe it's arson, no one really cares. If I set fire to a chimpanzee, I'm going to prison. But as computers become more lifelike, as they become more social, more interactive, more humanoid, I think we will be projecting onto them all sorts of qualities, so that if I destroy the childhood companion that looks like a person, acts like a person, sounds like a person, passes all the Turing test, then again our political considerations are going to come in, and there'll be protections that might be needed. But that's not the same as saying that we've got an answer to the good question that Julian raises about what consciousness is. Because the more we study artificial intelligence, I think sometimes the less we understand about human intelligence.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.